Right here I have the Canon FD 70 to 210mm f4. And so this is of course a Canon lens with the FD mount, which is a couple generations old at this point, which makes sense because this lens started production in 1980. So this lens is over 40 years old at this point, so definitely a full-on vintage lens. There's no autofocus, there's no electronics in this lens. And this particular lens was actually my dad's lens that he used on his older Canon A1 and Canon AE1 film cameras back in the day that he handed down to me, and now I use this all the time on all my digital cameras. In particular, I use this for professional video work on my Sony a7S III. So even though this lens is over 40 years old at this point, this is probably my most used vintage lens in my entire collection. And now I don't only use this lens to get that vintage look and just for fun. I use this lens just because of how versatile and just how sharp and great this is for being such an old lens like this. This is actually the only telephoto 70 to 200-ish lens that I have on my Sony a7S III, which I use for all my professional paid video production, my YouTube videos, and pretty much everything else. So this lens is legitimately a good enough all-around lens that I use it as my only telephoto lens on my a7S III. Now part of that has to do with the fact that I don't need telephoto lenses super often, and a Sony 70 to 200mm lens is going to be north of $1,000. And this one was handed down to me for free. To be honest, that's the main reason why I use this, but I've legitimately used this on paid video shoots and the results have been awesome. This is a very sharp lens. It doesn't have a crazy amount of vintage characteristics, which of course, you kind of would normally buy vintage lenses for the vintage characteristics. And I'm not going to say this doesn't have any, but this is just a solid, all-around great telephoto lens. And so at f4, you get a very sharp look. There's really no need to stop this down to sharpen it up or to, increase contrast or anything like that. Wide open at f4, it's sharp, it's detailed, there's not much vignetting or anything like that. It's just a really, really clean, great looking lens. And now it does have a little bit of that vintage creaminess to it that, you really can't explain. You just kind of notice it when you look at videos or photos shot on vintage lenses. But especially if you stop down to like f5.6, this can get away with being just a really clean telephoto lens. For about 50 bucks is what you can pick this up for used. And sometimes it's a little bit more expensive, but for about $50, you can pick up this lens. It's a 70 to 200 f4. Not the fastest aperture in the world, but a constant f4 is still a great aperture. It's pretty small and light, like you can see. It's versatile. It's built very well. It's really solid. It's made out of metal. And like I said, I've legitimately used this for paid video work for years now, and it has worked great for me. So for 50 bucks for this lens, I mean, there's really no downsides to it at that price point. There are a couple things to mention though. First of all, it is a push-pull zoom. So I'm zooming this in and out right now just by pushing it, not rotating it like a normal zoom lens would be. Now this was really popular on a lot of vintage lenses. I'm guessing it was just cheaper, or maybe that was just the first way, manufacturers found out how to design zoom lenses. But basically to zoom from 70 to 210mm, you just move this ring up and down just like that. And then to focus it, you turn it left and right. And you can see it kind of does extend a little bit while focusing. And also the front element does rotate when you're focusing as well. So if you have something like a polarizing filter on here, it's gonna rotate along with the focusing, which is a little bit annoying. Now also the push-pull zoom, I really wish I had two different rings, one to spin for zoom and one to spin for focusing. But honestly, for run and gun work, which again is what I use this most of the time for, run and gun video work on my Sony a7S III, having the zoom and the focus on one ring here where you can zoom and focus at the same time just by pushing it in and out while turning it. Once you get used to it, it makes this a really good lens for run and gun work. Again, that's once you get used to that. It's really weird to get used to at first, and it's even weirder to go back and forth between this and then just a standard zoom lens. But after you get the hang of this focus and zoom mechanism, this is really an awesome lens for run and gun work, being able to just use one hand to zoom and focus at the exact same time. But that, along with the rotating front element, are pretty much the only two downsides I can think of with this lens. Again, for 50 bucks, you really cannot go wrong. This is a sharp, clean, great looking vintage lens. It gives you that 70 to 200 focal length for, a fraction of the price of a Sony or newer Canon one would be. And the last thing I actually forgot to mention, this has a whole macro mode in it out. So if you're zoomed all the way out to 70 millimeters and you turn this to the closest focus distance and then go even farther, it enters this macro mode where you can get some really crazy macro photos and videos with this lens, which just adds even more to the versatility. I've used this for tons of B-roll for YouTube videos to get that really close-up macro look on products and things like that. And overall, for 50 bucks, you pretty much cannot beat this lens, and I would highly recommend checking it out.